Welcome to the podcast PUNKT.UA with Tinka
and Anna. This podcast is dedicated to Ukrainian studies.
We conduct interviews with scholars researching Ukraine.
Join us on the PUNKT.UA, the podcast of the UNDIPUS project,
which stands for Pluralizing Ukrainian Studies, Understanding the War in Ukraine. Our guest today is Professor Andreas Langenohl, a distinguished sociologist holding a chair in comparative social studies. Currently a professor at Justus Liebig University Giessen, he has held numerous international fellowships, including Cornell University, the University of Freiburg, and Ghent University, and is extraordinary professor of political studies at Northwest University, South Africa. Welcome. You specialized in different topics: economics, sociology, and the social studies of finance, the epistemology of the social science, transnationalism, and political sociology, and cultural and social theory. Could you tell us how have you developed your interest in Ukraine, and what is your current research on Ukrainian society focusing on?
Yeah, to begin with, thanks very much for having me in this conversation. I'm really honored by it and happy to contribute. So I have a study background in sociology and Slavic studies, and I have worked on the political sociology of societal change after the end of the Soviet Union, mainly with respect to Russia, already more than 20 years ago, partly, so that was part of my PhD work actually. But regarding my present interest in Ukraine, the point of entry into this specific field of research, the LGBTQ amidst the war in Ukraine, was a different one. And so I will briefly sketch that. Over the last 10 years, I have been engaged in what is referred to in the social sciences as critical security studies. At the universities of Giessen and Marburg, we host a collaborative research center, a Sonderforschungsbereich named Dynamics of Security. Funded by the German Research Foundation. My own empirical research there mainly concerns something else, namely the mingling of concerns of financial and political security, but this is not what we're going to talk about today. Well, one major cross-cutting point of this research is that the labeling of certain policy areas as relevant for security, for instance, for national security, often brings with itself an actual reduction in essential security for disadvantaged and marginalized groups in society. And I think that international war is really a paradigmatic example of this. As national security is at stake, the security and safety concerns of minorities and disadvantaged groups tend to recede or be pushed back into the background. These groups lose protection above average, so to speak. And with respect to Ukraine, Marina Shevtsova, among others, for instance, has shown this for Roma communities and sex workers who have seen their security specifically diminished by the war. Now, when Russia's full-fledged and open aggression started in 2022, the concerns of LGBTQ people became publicly articulated in quite contradictory ways. On the one hand, international media outlets reported about the support of LGBTQ communities and individuals for the national defense. This was the case, for instance, and it was really, as it were, a paradigmatic case for the international spokesperson of the Ukrainian army, Sarah Ashton-Kirillo, who is a former US journalist to Ukraine, identifying as trans female. They told the media about how their position in the military allows them to help the cause of the defense without their gender identity being a constantly relevant question in the first place. And to cite another example, Viktor Pilipenko, a gay Donbas veteran and activist since 2018, was quoted in the media in support of the acceptance of LGBTQ people in the army. Yet on the other hand, I received notification about the increasingly deteriorating situation of queer and especially of trans people in Ukraine, and I received those messages mainly through international advocacy networks such as All Out, to which I subscribe. They reported about a rising existential danger for LGBTQ, both from the Russian army and from homophobes in Ukraine, and also about problems for LGBTQ to find efficient support when leaving for European Union countries, if they could leave in the first place, because discrimination can be found in the EU as well. So it was these contradictory public representations of the consequences of the war for LGBTQ constituencies, both in Ukraine and beyond, that triggered the questions that I try to work on now. So How does the war and the condition of threatened national security transform the specific conditions of security and safety for these groups? What is their agency under these conditions? And can one see these processes as critical commentaries on mainstream renditions of the war as a geopolitical conflict over political values? Hence, I started, together with my co-worker Bastian Sebastiani Lassiter, to whom I owe much gratitude for his work and perseverance, to collect public data about the situation of LGBTQ constituencies amidst the war.
You mentioned minorities and marginalized groups. Last year, Gayatri Spivak discussed Ukraine as post-colonial country, highlighting the complexities of unequal power relations in post-Soviet societies. And she also noted that Ukrainian society has its own subaltern groups, including LGBTQ. Would you agree with this perspective? How do you perceive the position of LGBTQ individuals within Ukrainian society?
To begin with, I would say that the material that I've been working with might be incomplete with respect to that answer. So it focuses mainly on the public thematization and problematization of LGBTQ individuals by themselves as well. So it's a kind of material that, for instance, also Irving Goffman worked with in his Stigma book from 1963, but it has its limits because it portrays those voices that you can find in the public, and there are many other voices that cannot be heard there. And in this regard, I also want to direct the attention to scholars like Olga Plachotnik, who is here with us today, who ground their research not only on document analysis, but also on participant observation, for instance. On the basis of the discourse the data that I did analyze, however, it seems to me that the position of LGBTQ constituencies within Ukraine is contradictory. On the one hand, before the war, Kiev was internationally celebrated as one media outlet put it, the queer capital of Eastern Europe. With the beginning of the full-fledged war, there was indication that queer people openly, at least some queer people openly and voluntarily joined the armed forces to participate in the defense of the country against Russia. Since 2022, also some politicians, including President Zelensky, initiated and supported steps toward enlarging the rights of LGBTQ, for instance, the rights of partners of maimed or killed soldiers, although this is a quite complicated process as it turns out. On the other hand, LGBTQ still need to rely on their own networks to survive the war and recently face increasing threats and violence from far-right forces, so All Out just sent another message regarding this just the other day. I will only exemplarily name the organization Trini Yadin in Kiev, which aims at providing shelter and safe spaces for LGBTQ people against military threats, but also other threats. So the war has not changed the marginalization of these groups. They still need their own safe spaces, as it were. In principle, this contradictoriness of positions of LGBTQ regarding the dominant society or also the military is nothing that would be specific for Ukraine. In Germany, for instance, there's a comparatively inclusive legislation regarding the rights of LGBTQ, but on the other hand, the violence against these groups tremendously arose over the last years, as becomes evident from official reports. So between 2022 and 2023, the numbers basically doubled. Their rights become officially legally acknowledged while the attacks against them increase. So to come back to Spivak's point, finally, the subalternity of LGBTQ people is greatly in flux today, it seems to me. It's not a position that would be stabilized through its marginality.
After the war began, many far-right groups that had previously committed acts of violence against LGBTQ organizations and people joined the Ukrainian armed forces, gaining recognition as heroes and defenders. So this dynamic has caused division within the Ukrainian LGBTQ movement, as far as I know, over whether to support or condemn individuals who violently attacked them in the past. For example, in my hometown, a major street was renamed after a member of far-right group, Freikorps, who had harassed and attacked members of local LGBTQ community for many years, but later died in this war. Some people from local LGBTQ movement supported the renaming of this street after this person, arguing that past actions are no longer relevant, while others condemned it, asserting that the homophobe and aggressor should not be honored. In your research, have you encountered similar conflicts and contradictions? And do you think any form of solidarity between far-right groups and LGBTQ organizations is possible, both generally and also in the circumstances of the war?
Regarding the first question, conflicts and contradictions with respect to how LGBTQ position themselves vis-a-vis far-right forces. Maybe I'll start with the motto of the Kiev Pride Parade in 2024, in which roughly 1,000 people took part, and that motto was for equal rights and victory. And to my mind, this framing of the Pride was an attempt to reconcile the causes of national security and of the security situation of LGBTQ instead of pitting the one against the other. At the same time, however, there's indication that the question of loyalty to the national defense cause does have some potential to split the community. One known case is that of Zifa Melos, a trans female artist who left Ukraine for Germany in 2022 and reported in international media outlets about harassments and acute danger in Ukraine. These reports were then in turn harshly criticized on the media platform Detalier. Zi's leaving for Germany was categorized as, quote, illegal border crossing by trans women, end quote, and she was accused of not having sought the support of LGBTQ organizations in Ukraine. While this case does not involve far-right groups, it testifies to a tension in contemporary Ukrainian society between the concerns of general national defense and those of disadvantaged individuals and groups who might not see their security guaranteed through military defense. Now, your second question about potential alliances between LGBTQ and far-right forces is, of course, much more general in nature and much more, as it were, maybe also conceptually and theoretically in need of reflection. In this respect, I remember a conversation with Kay Alison Hammer, who is a queer and trans theorist and recently published a book on masculinities and transition. So they visited Giessen last year. In that conversation, Alison explained that there is no such thing as a positionality as gay, lesbian, queer, trans, or otherwise that would per se guarantee an immunity against exclusivist political projects. This is very much in line again with post-structuralist theories of political alliances, such as Ernesto Laclaus and Chantal Mouffe's hegemony theory, which see political alliances and confrontations as historically contingent and not as outflows of essential identities. I think this is very important. Supporting this view, in some EU countries, there's evidence of persons who are out as gay or lesbian, yet at the same time position themselves as leaders of far-right political parties or propagate an exclusivist conservatism. Already in the 2000s, Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands led a far-right party that claimed to defend Western liberalism, explicitly including queer rights against an alleged Muslimization of Europe. So I am not acutely aware of any LGBT organization in Ukraine that would openly align with a far-right political stance, but please correct me if I'm wrong here. But I would say that no positionality as LGBTQ per se immunizes anyone against such an alliance. Maybe more generally, or to also invoke a more general frame here, already in an article from 2016, Tamara Martsenyuk has warned against the trend in Ukrainian LGBTQ constituencies to reproduce so-called homo-nationalism, that is to say, a self-attribution to norms and standards deemed modern, superior, and usually Western, while implying a degradation of any other stance as outdated, inferior, and non-Western. Of course, I'm not the one to speak about that in the presence of Olga Plachotnikov, who is here with us and has investigated into debates about homo-nationalism within LGBTQ communities in Ukraine. And I think that Olga's work really shows that debates about potential chauvinism within LGBTQ groups are underway. And these debates, I think, are also necessary because no explicitly LGBTQ positionality would ever be able to claim the driver's seat in a coalition with far-right forces.
From the media, we know that some LGBTQ people joined the armed forces of Ukraine. Obviously, any army is traditionally very patriarchal and sexist structure by its very nature. On top of that, the presence of the far-right there is not a secret too. In the public labeling of the opponents, both sides of the war actively use homophobe denominations as a way to insult and humiliate the enemy. What does your research show regarding the position and self-positioning of the LGBTQ in the Ukrainian armed forces?
My research is quite limited in this regard, as already mentioned, because so far it only refers to public representations and testimonies of LGBTQ vis-a-vis or within the Ukrainian armed forces. Yet even these selective representations reveal a contradictory picture. Sometimes the inclusiveness of the army is praised, offering acknowledgement to volunteers, such as trans persons who were reported to stitching a unicorn insignia to their UAF uniform so as to underline their gender non-conforming presence in the national defense. But in other accounts, the army is portrayed as an institution that increases the vulnerability of LGBTQ, denying LGBTQ soldiers and personnel that solidarity that is totally vital under conditions of military confrontation. Overall, it seems to me there's a difference between people voluntarily joining the army, which seemed to be a phenomenon in Ukraine mainly in 2022, and people being drafted, which has become a quite sensitive topic in Ukraine in the meantime in general. My impression is that LGBTQ people were inclusively welcomed to the armed forces as volunteers, while still confronting discrimination and humiliation when drafted. And I'd say that at the heart of this problem is not only outright discrimination or homophobia, but the continuing binarism between male and female gender attributions much more generally, and the related binarisms between ideas about masculinity and femininity. In most countries the world over, military draft distinguishes between men and women. Hence, military mobilization reinforces gender binarism. Most immediately, this puts trans female persons under pressure. This refers not just to countries where a diverse sex category is legally unacknowledged, which is the case in Ukraine as in most other countries. It applies also to countries with a more gender diverse inclusiveness, such as very recently Germany, where trans female sex categories still cannot be applied for under conditions of strong international tensions and of national defense. So that was basically a law that was passed last year here. Also, the gender binarism enforced by military draft carries stereotypes about masculine role behavior, which, for instance, makes male gay soldiers who are out vulnerable for discrimination. In this regard, there are some very interesting studies pertaining to Azerbaijan, which show that hegemonic masculinity, to use a concept offered by Rabin Connell, can be quite attractive, in particular for gay men. According to Ramil Zamanov's studies based on interviews with queer people in Baku, gay men fear the army as a site of discrimination and violence against them, while some of them still aspire to find a place in the army because this would affirm their masculinity in the eyes of their relevant social contexts. Hence, even if this finding from Azerbaijan might not be applicable to the UAF, it still shows that membership in homophobic institutions may be aspired for by queer people.
Western media and academia often portrays Ukraine as an open and tolerant society, including claims of inclusivity towards LGBTQ communities. However, during the war, we observe a contradictory reality. On the one hand, prides are almost the few collective gatherings permitted in Ukraine. On the other hand, LGBTQ organizations attempting public events not only face attacks from the far-right groups, often linked to the Ukrainian military units, but also doesn't get substantial protection, as seen during the prides in Kiev and Kharkiv and other LGBTQ-focused public gatherings countrywide. Where do you think this contradiction stems from? Would you say the inclusivity of Ukrainian society is more declarative than substantive?
The portrayal of Ukraine as an LGBTQ open country refers, as probably any portrayal, to factual correspondences as well as to discursive framings. I find the political legal initiative to strengthen the rights of LGBTQ people amidst an ongoing war of aggression that Ukraine suffers absolutely remarkable. So I was talking about that law that is under discussion in Ukraine right now to strengthen the rights of partners of soldiers, for instance. To my knowledge, this is without precedent in the history of national polities facing a war of aggression. And I think that this is all the more important since an openness for LGBTQ lifestyles and concerns was driven in many countries by political actors and by legislation together with LGBTQ organizations, so that legislation was often more emancipation-minded than the majority of society. And this is indirectly also confirmed by many tendencies in Western countries whose legislation might endorse LGBTQ rights, while significant social and political forces in society increase their violence against them. So I deeply admire political institutions and NGOs in Ukraine that work towards attaining equal rights and lifestyle recognition for LGBTQ against forceful resistance by far-right social groups, and maybe also by cultural sentiments within large sectors of society. And at the same time, I think that those political and social struggles are nowhere over and done with. Ukrainian societies and polities' openness towards LGBTQ lifestyles and indeed lives might not be categorically more or less declarative as opposed to substantive than that of many Western countries. And finally, and relatedly, let me briefly turn to the discursive framing of Ukraine by Western media. At least since the open war of Russia against the country, there is a tendency in Western media outlets and partly also in academia to frame Ukraine as a Western or European society and to attribute values named liberal to it. This framing becomes problematic, however, if it rests on the presupposition that LGBTQ rights and life projects are fully endorsed in the West. They are not. Just take a look at massively publicly present anti-trans rhetorics and political projects, with Donald Trump and Elon Musk in the US being only the most notorious, but by no means the only examples in the West.
Some publicly active commanders of the Ukrainian armed forces have called for the legal prohibition of the so-called LGBT propaganda. This is a demand that mirrors Russia's law on the prohibition of LGBT propaganda. Meanwhile, a prevalent narrative among Ukrainian and European officials is that Ukraine is fighting a civilizational war for European values against so-called Russian barbarians. Do you think LGBTQ rights are being instrumentalized as a discursive tool in this conflict? How do the attitudes of all stakeholders of this war to LGBTQ generally shape the perception of the armed conflict?
The Russian official discourse clearly instrumentalizes LGBTQ concerns, portraying them as a danger to society and as being infiltrated with Western power claims. In comparison to this blatant instrumentalization, I think things are a bit different when it comes to many Western governments' discourse about LGBTQ rights. And told bluntly, it seems to me that for Western governments, LGBTQ are less important than for the Russian government. So, in the context of the war in Ukraine, LGBTQ concerns in general seem to be used politically much more for mobilizing against an opponent and not for the rights of a social group, which is quite a familiar pattern of security thinking. Security is held to be where the external threat is neutralized, not where the internally marginalized group is protected. So, maybe a pointed question to put to the commanders of the UAF in favor of anti-LGBTQ politics that you cited would thus be whether they identify LGBTQ in Ukraine as part of the external threat that the war of aggression constitutes. Coming back to Western discourse on the significance of LGBTQ in the war, there is a discrepancy in the way that Western governments, or some of them, claim liberal values associated with individual freedom, human rights, equal opportunity, and by implication also LGBTQ rights for themselves on the one hand, and the social, legal, and political reality of LGBTQ in Western countries on the other hand. Homophobic and in particular transphobic discrimination and violence cannot only be found in illiberal democracies such as Hungary, but also in core NATO states like Germany and the US. If anything, and I already mentioned this, this violence and discrimination have become exacerbated over the recent years. And I already also mentioned that LGBTQ individuals from Ukraine find it difficult to attain effective support in Western countries. Hence, the fact that the Russian government's propaganda associates queerness with the decadence of Western democracies and liberalism does not imply that LGBTQ concerns are effectively protected by values and institutions named Western. This situation also might be read as a critical commentary on the geopolitical framing of the war in Ukraine as a conflict between opposing sets of political values. So I think this is really how the conflict is very often portrayed, publicly and politically. Taking into account the experience of LGBTQ constituencies, wars and situations of military confrontation, which are very often portrayed as hotbeds for the alignment and disambiguation of value cleavages, might turn out to be much more ambiguous and to have transversal effects in terms of the articulation of political values.
One of the leading Ukrainian gender studies scholars, Irina Zherebkina, says that the war poses additional challenges to the feminist and LGBTQ movements, requiring them to unite around the state kind of for protection of women's and LGBTQ rights, among other things. So she asked the question of whether the contemporary Ukrainian feminism is possible as a critical theory and practice and not just as a reaction to yet another request from the authorities. What do you think about this question and what your answer to it would be?
I guess that I would frame my answer again in regard to critical security studies that I mentioned at the beginning. And there's an interesting discussion here, which is inspired by debates in feminism about so-called radical care. So important names here would be Hilary Hobart and Tamara Nees, for instance. Radical care is a concept developed as a response to many states' inability to provide for existential security and safety, for instance, in the area of public health and social security. And with a view to present-day Ukraine, of course, there's another existential security that is under threat, namely basically the security of everyday life under threat by military action. So radical care proceeds from the general idea that care constitutes a social relationship much more than an institutionalized responsibility, and that relationship is ideally mutual and reciprocal and can be adapted to different circumstances and form different care constituencies, which can then be stabilized through non-institutional means. So it's a kind of horizontal idea of care, one could say. And clearly, LGBT groups in present-day Ukraine and elsewhere endeavor to engage in such care relationships, for instance, through creating safe spaces for members of the community. To be sure, the concept of radical care has found its critics. They question, for instance, whether it's really viable to think of care as something that is not enshrined as a legal right, but something that totally depends on informal social constellations and maybe even interpersonal obligations. So I would say that the state or some kind of, as it were, institution remains an inevitable point of reference for any such strategy in Ukraine, not least because of the war. But still, I think that it is important to investigate and theorize relationships that would be able to actualize aspects of care not reducible to shelter from violent threat. Security then would mean not just the absence of threat, but also the presence of care, or more generally, the presence of some sort of social empowerment and political emancipation. And interesting, also in security studies, this was theorized by Ken Booth already in 1991, so that security should mean more than the absence of threat. What I want to say is that this enlarged notion of security and safety might redeem a sociological perspective on society, even under conditions of war and of aggression. It might be capable to address issues of ongoing and aggravating inequality and discrimination beyond the question of national security. Ultimately, care, empowerment, and emancipation will have to be addressed to the authorities as demands. Recently, I have been in conversation with the NGO Poruch in Ukraine, which continues to dedicate its work to improving the situation and presence of women in employment, politics, and higher education, also under conditions of warfare, addressing political representatives and authorities with its suggestions and demands. This work might be seen as one possible political answer to Jerebkina's critique.
You have already mentioned that transgender rights are frequently overlooked in the context of this conflict. The binary gender systems in Ukrainian official documents means that individuals legally recognized as male are barred from leaving the country and are subject to conscription. This is just one of many challenges trans people face. What does your research reveal about the specific experiences of trans individuals during the war? Do they face additional pressure or unique obstacles compared to others?
Yeah, I already mentioned some of the peculiar challenges of trans people in Ukraine under war conditions that have to do with the non-recognition, for instance, of a trans female gender. And this is clearly something that becomes very evident on the basis of the documents that I analyzed. So I'm fully in line with the question. And so another challenge is, of course, the difficult access to transition-related medication. But more generally, I would say that the situation of trans people exposes a fundamental feature of war, namely that war is a fundamentally public affair. The conscription interview is the paradigmatic example of how the gender binarism publicly, that is in the presence of state authorities, scandalizes transness. To draw the comparison, for instance, with gay men who may opt to not disclose their sexual orientation in the army, it is almost impossible for trans people to not be out in times of war. And this makes them much more vulnerable to long-established patterns of discrimination, which are not caused by the war, even if they are exacerbated through it.
Ukrainian historian Marta Gavrashko often publicly reports instances of violence against LGBTQ events and communities supported or initiated by certain units of the Ukrainian armed forces. For this, she has faced threats from far-right groups and criticism from some members of the Ukrainian academic community. What has been your experience conducting research on such a sensitive and emotionally charged topic, especially amidst the ongoing war where normative, moral, and emotional values are deeply intertwined. Do you think there is a right or wrong time to study gender issues and gender-related problems?
I am a newcomer to this field of study, and the research has not been published so far, so I cannot report on any threat or criticism with respect to it. Right now, my overall concern is rather whether I will be able to maneuver the balancing act between studying the concerns of LGBTQ constituencies in and beyond Ukraine and accounting for the effects that this research might have on those constituencies. And this is a fundamental ethical issue, which I hope I will be able to discuss with members of that constituency. Concerning the second question, so what is the right or wrong time to study gender? Given the continuing utmost significance of gender and sexuality attributions for inequality in society, I think that any time is the right time to study gender-related issues. Yet, every historical conjecture provides its own reasons why it is the right moment to engage in that study. Currently, there is an international backlash against the causes of LGBTQ, notwithstanding human rights-oriented legislation in some countries in the recent past, which is, however, counterweight by aggressive anti-LGBTQ legislation in Russia, in Hungary, and in a growing number also of African countries where violently homophobic legislation is backed by US-based religious organizations, and hence politically in the US as well. In addition, gender studies, along with other inequality-related fields of studies, such as critical whiteness studies, for instance, are increasingly pressurized by far-right political forces. This is ongoing in the US, but also in many European countries, including Germany, where the far-right party Alternative für Deutschland demands the closing of gender studies departments and study programs, emulating the Hungarian model case. More than ever, perhaps the study of gender-related questions must be analytically concerned with the backlashes against itself. This, I think, is an important part of the present historical conjecture of gender-related research, and it gives me confidence to see, and I want to express my admiration that exactly these developments, that is, taking into account what the nature of these backlashes against gender studies is and what one needs to learn from it. These developments, these reflections are already underway.
Then our last question is, are there any recommendations that can contribute to the solution of all these problems and dilemmas and be applied to improve the situation of LGBT people in Ukrainian society?
I cannot pretend to be a political advisor, but still I believe it's important to listen to LGBTQ and women's organizations and individuals in Ukraine to acknowledge the heterogeneity of and also sometimes tensions between their positionings and to hear their suggestions how to improve the situation. And apart from that baseline, I could maybe offer the following reflections on the question. As a general institutional point, legislation is exceedingly important. It can give LGBTQ constituencies a powerful normative point of reference to place their concerns, even if it does not per se guarantee safety from violence and discrimination. So even if all legislation has to be implemented to be effective, it is also clear that the worsening of the situation of LGBTQ often starts with anti-LGBTQ legislative initiatives that then provide the justification for discrimination, exclusion, violence, and expulsion. Discursively, an important point will be to resist any homogenizing reframing of the political collective. LGBTQ, the acronym and its ever-expanding incompleteness tells it stand for social and cultural heterogeneity, not homogeneity. Admittedly, this is a difficult discursive project under the conditions of a war of aggression, when the discursive frame of the sovereign nation-states tends to overshadow any concerns about social heterogeneity. And on top of that, this discursive frame is supported by international geopolitical representations of the war as a conflict between different values, the implication being that these are homogeneous within themselves. But they are not, as the tensions between the claim of Western values and the actual conditions of LGBTQ in Western societies confirms. And lastly, for Western governments and political supporters of Ukraine in its defense against the Russian aggression, a quite ambitious lesson might be to learn what support of Ukraine actually can mean beyond the delivery of arms. Ukraine is a very complex, highly differentiated, heterogeneous society, like any society. The condition of LGBTQ in Ukraine will profit from international support only if this heterogeneity, with all its contradictions, is recognized and strengthened.
Thank you very much for joining us. It was our pleasure.
I was really honored. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you too. Thank you, Anya, for preparing the interview and leading the interview. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
This was the podcast PUNKT.UA,
which is part of the UNDIPUS project at the University of Greifswald,
supported by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research.
Join us on the PUNKT.UA podcast.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.